So there are a lot of modes of communication. For instance, right now I am communicating to you with noise, with auditory communication. I can communicate visually, right? We're doing a little bit of visual communication too, right? On your screen, you're looking at the PowerPoint and you're looking at my hands waving all over the place. And in the case of the endocrine system, they use chemical communication, right? But in all these cases, you need to have receptors in order for that communication to occur, right? You don't just need a signal; you need something that receives that signal. So, for auditory communication, you have to have ears, right? For visual communication, you have to have eyes with a retina, and for chemical communication, you have to have a particular kind of receptor that matches up with that chemical. Now, there are different kinds of receptors for different kinds of chemicals. Epinephrine, for instance, will not fit into a receptor for thyroid hormone, right? They're just different shape, different physical shape. And even for epinephrine, for a single hormone, you may have multiple different receptors that may give multiple different responses to the same chemical, right? So, for instance, epinephrine, adrenaline, will cause my heart to go faster. It stimulates my cardiac muscle cells, right? That said, it relaxes the smooth muscle cells in my throat, in my trachea and bronchi to allow more air in. So, same chemical, same signal molecule, but different receptors will cause a stimulating effect or a relaxing effect. For most hormones, which are hydrophilic, water soluble, they can move through your bloodstream just fine because your blood plasma is water, but the phospholipid bilayer of your plasma membrane on your cells is made of lipids. And so your hydrophilic hormone can't get through there on its own. So you have to have a receptor in the membrane that will bind to the hormone and then cause a change to something inside the cell and thereby deliver that message from something that was outside the cell to information that's inside the cell. Very often they'll use something called a second messenger, which we'll talk about in a moment, and very often you use something called a G protein coupled receptor. These second messengers are going to be chemicals on the inside which are released because of the action of this hormone. The first messenger from the outside, it binds to your receptor, and then the receptors binding to that changes shape and causes some sort of second messenger, some sort of other chemical to be released on the inside that will cause a change to happen in the cell, usually turning on a protein, making it active. Maybe an enzyme that will cause a chemical reaction to go forth. Maybe it will turn on a certain gene by allowing that gene to produce messenger RNA. Here's an example of this with a G protein coupled receptor. So we have a hormone, it binds to this protein receptor, and this protein receptor is going to change shape in response to this. So if you remember from last semester, proteins have primary structure, which is the sequence of amino acids, right? Like the letters of the alphabet that you put together to make your sentence. Secondary structure is the way those amino acids interact with the amino acids directly on either side of them, making a pleated sheet or a helical structure. And then tertiary structure is how stretches of amino acids interact with other stretches of amino acids later on in the sequence in the polypeptide. So, for instance, if they are both positive, two positive stretches of amino acids, they will repel from one another because like charges repel. If one is positive and one is negative, they may be attracted, right? If they are not polar or not charged at all, if they're non-polar, hydrophobic, they'll be sort of pushed to the middle of the protein so to stay away from the water. And if they're hydrophilic, they may be pushed to the outside. And you have all these little interactions that cause this crazy three-dimensional structure, and the structure gives the protein its function. Right? You change the structure, you've changed the function. So when a hormone binds to that, right, all of a sudden you have a new set of amino acids that are interacting with all of this, and you find a new stable shape, right? Might be very different, might be very similar. But in this case, the change in shape will activate this G protein that's attached to it. It will cause it to change shape, and then it will change some ATP. It will use that energy, but it'll turn that ATP into CAMP, or cyclic AMP, If ATP is adenosine triphosphate, AMP is adenosine monophosphate, right? We just lose 2 phosphates. Or that G protein coupled receptor can open up a channel nearby and allow calcium to come through. And in this case, either a cyclic AMP or calcium will act as that second messenger on the inside of the cell. This is a video that you can find in your A&P Flicks on Mastering A&P. It's helpful if you're having trouble figuring out how these second messengers work. So while hydrophilic hormones, which include most amino acid derivatives or monoamines, as well as most peptide hormones, can move through the bloodstream just fine without any trouble because they are able to dissolve in the water of your blood plasma. And then they get to your plasma membrane and they can't cross into your cell. They need to bind to a receptor on that plasma membrane. Steroid hormones are the opposite. They need help moving through your blood plasma. Remember, they need to bind to a transport protein to be able to dissolve in your blood plasma and move through your body. But once they get to your cell, they can move right across that plasma membrane because it's made of lipids, and so are they. It's hydrophobic, and so are they. So steroid hormones do not need receptors on the outside of the cell. They go right through that plasma membrane and they find receptors on the inside of the cell. That receptor might just be in the cytoplasm here. That receptor might actually be in the nucleus. Because very often what's going to happen is once the hormone is bound to the receptor, that new complex of both of them becomes a molecule that can unzip your DNA at a very specific spot and turn on a gene, right, which will allow you to make a different protein, right? So maybe you make a protein that speeds up metabolism, right? So that thyroid hormone would cause that. Maybe this is testosterone, right? And this cell is a hair follicle on my chin, and it stimulates the production of keratin, so I can grow hair on my chinny chin thanks to testosterone, right? Either way, it has a receptor that's inside the cell, and it will usually act by turning on a gene. All right, now we're going to move on to a deep dive into every single endocrine organ in your body, or at least the primary ones. And we're going to start and spend the most time on your hypothalamus and your anterior pituitary gland. Because as I said in the last video, these two run the show. They run your endocrine system. And the anterior pituitary is your Darth Vader, right? It runs the show in that it tells all your other glands what to do. It tells them when to secrete their hormone and when to not secrete their hormone. But the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary what to do. So it is our Emperor Palpatine, so it's really running the show. And the hypothalamus does a couple of things. So it does produce 2 hormones that are not involved in that hypothalamus anterior pituitary system that we were talking about. They actually are produced by the hypothalamus. They're stored and released by the posterior pituitary, not the anterior pituitary, but the posterior pituitary. And they include antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that causes you to hold on to as much water as possible. So it targets your kidneys, and we'll talk about the precise mechanism by which it does that when we get to the kidneys. But suffice it to say that it causes you to hold on to water. So when you're dehydrated, you secrete antidiuretic hormone, and it causes you to hold on to water instead of urinating it out. So when you're secreting antidiuretic hormone, you'll have less urine, and your urine will be more concentrated, so much more like yellowy, right, instead of clear. Diuretics, like coffee or alcohol, block the function of antidiuretic hormone and cause you to lose a lot of that water that you want to save, and so you end up urinating a lot more. And initially, your urine is going to be a lot more clear and more abundant, but then eventually you're going to get dehydrated, and the symptoms of dehydration often include things like dry mouth and a headache, and a lot of those things that I'm sure you've never experienced before in your life. Oxytocin, also produced by the hypothalamus and stored and released from the posterior pituitary, is a hormone that does a couple of things. First of all, it's involved in the contraction of smooth muscle. So it's important during labor. it's produced in increasing amounts during labor. It causes contraction of the smooth muscle in the uterus, which kind of pushes the baby down, which causes stretching of the cervix, and that's part of a positive feedback system loop that you may have talked about already, where that stretching of the cervix causes production of more oxytocin, which causes more contraction, which pushes down harder, which causes more cervical stretching, which causes more oxytocin production, etc., etc., etc. It is also released during nursing. When a baby nurses at the breast, that causes mom to secrete oxytocin, which causes the contraction of smooth muscles around the mammary glands, which pushes out milk for the baby. But in addition to the fact that it is a hormone that causes contraction, it's also a lovey-dovey hormone, right? It causes bonding and lovey-dovey feelings, which is important during nursing, right? That's one of the reasons why nursing can cause that bonding. It's also important because at the end of labor, which is a very tough process, so it seems when I watch my wife go through it, you're exhausted and you're in pain and you just went through all of that, and they put that baby in your arms, and instead of hating that baby forever, you're flooded with oxytocin, and they put that baby in your arms, and you feel that bonding, and you're bonded for life, right? That's what oxytocin does. It's also released during sex because there's contraction of the smooth muscle of the uterus during sex that's associated with orgasm, and that oxytocin also causes a bonding feeling, and so sex can also cause a bonding effect. In addition to the production of oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, the hypothalamus also has a role in stimulating your adrenal medulla, which makes epinephrine and norepinephrine, and adrenaline. And more importantly, it also secretes regulatory hormones that, as I said, communicate with the anterior pituitary and cause it to produce its hormones. So it's going to start a lot of these cascades of hormones where you're stimulated to produce a regulatory hormone from your hypothalamus. That hormone will stimulate your anterior pituitary to produce another hormone that will then target another gland, which will then produce its hormone, which will then target a part of your body, which will then have a response, right? These long, relatively complicated sets of chain reactions. And it's able to communicate with your anterior pituitary via this stalk called the infundibulum that holds the pituitary gland of the hypothalamus through a special set of blood vessels called a hypophyseal portal system. Now, a portal system is a special set of vessels where instead of just going from your heart arteries to capillaries at your organs to drop off oxygen, pick up CO2, veins come back to the heart, right? Arteries from the heart to the organ, veins from the organ to the heart, and capillaries at the organ for exchange of gases. You have a second set of capillaries in there. So you have artery, capillaries. Instead of a vein, you have a portal vein that goes to a second set of capillaries, and then a vein that comes back to the heart. So this hypophyseal portal system, hypophysis is another word for your pituitary gland, has a set of capillaries at your hypothalamus, and then a portal vessel that goes directly to your anterior pituitary where there is a second set of capillaries. And what this allows is it allows your hypothalamus to send these regulatory hormones directly to your anterior pituitary without sending them all over your body, right? It allows Emperor Palpatine up here to whisper orders quietly into the ear of your Darth Vader anterior pituitary. So when I inevitably ask you on a test, name the structure that produces this hormone. If you see blank releasing hormone or blank inhibiting hormone, it is almost certainly produced by the hypothalamus, and it is almost certainly targeting the anterior pituitary. So if you see releasing hormone or inhibiting hormone, that's a good clue for you. In the next video, we're going to talk a lot about the anterior pituitary, and we're going to talk about some of those chain reactions that we mentioned before.